The life of civilians under the Nazi regime. In 1933, Germany came from the Weimar Republic, marked by a profound decline, but Adolf Hitler gave German society what it needed by strengthening its morale. Although the country was militarized by his regime, for the vast majority of the population, it was a place where happiness prevailed and was projected as a prosperous country inspired by National Socialist values. Older men, veterans of the First World War, and the youth grew up with a deep sense of vengeance and revenge against those who had humiliated them after the defeat in the Great War. They were the reflection of a society that would end up being complicit, directly or indirectly, in one of the most atrocious processes in history, the Jewish Holocaust, which consolidated Hitler's power absolutely. January 30th, 1933, is considered the darkest day in Germany, as the conservative government that emerged days before the ballot box would appoint Hitler as head of the government. From his privileged position, Hitler quickly disposed of the non-Nazi ministers and, shortly after, with the death of the elderly Marshal Hindenburg, Adolf Hitler reached the leadership of the nation and the government. It was July 20th, 1934. In just over a year, he had become the head of state and government of Germany. Welcome to Frontline War Memoirs. The rise of Hitler and his Nazi Party to power in Germany was due to a series of circumstances, among which we should highlight the democratic regime of the Weimar Republic had to return to the victorious countries of the First World War, France, Great Britain, and the United States, a large sum of money as war reparations, which it did not have. The selfishness of the victorious countries of the First World conflict in not forgiving their hefty debt to Germany caused a very severe economic crisis and the rise of extreme conservative parties and Marxism. The German economy also plunged into the abyss of the global economic crisis. Hyperinflation reached unimaginable levels. The prices of products rose to astronomical heights within hours, while the unemployment rate exceeded 30%, and misery and hunger took hold of the country. Hitler was able to attract both industrialists and large landowners who, in the past, had been favored by the state, especially during the imperial monarchy of Wilhelm II, the last German Kaiser. Subsequently, Hitler created the SS to counteract the SA, whom he distrusted. In 1929, he came into contact with the industrialist Hugenberg as he needed armed pickets against the communists. The Nazi Party greatly increased its deputies thanks to Hitler's good oratory when presenting his ideas, thus earning the trust of the subproletariat, certain unemployed individuals, and the discontented bourgeoisie. However, Adolf Hitler did not play fair within the democratic system of the Weimar Republic, as he used the SA and SS to eliminate all opposition to Nazism in the most brutal way, even employing weapons to kill his opponents. Without the systematic application of terror in the main streets of German cities, Hitler could hardly have achieved power in Germany. In 1932, he ran for the presidential elections, and although he was defeated, he obtained 13.5 million votes. In January 1933, he occupied the chancellery with the conservative von Papen. Then Hitler dissolved the parliament, initiated a campaign funded by the magnates of the Ruhr, von Thyssen, Otto Wolf, Vögele, marked by the violence of the Schutzstaffel, the SS, the militarized police of the Nazi Party, and the burning of the Reichstag in Berlin on February 27th, an event he used to his advantage by attributing its authorship to communist subversion, and that gave him the pretext to institute the state of emergency. The new Chancellor von Papen, who represented the right, granted Hitler the dissolution of the parliament and authorized the SS and the SA. On January 30th, 1933, Hitler had to settle for occupying power along with the conservatives. Hitler began by dissolving the parliament and launched a campaign in which the SA changed the outcome. Because of all this, on March 5th, the Nazis obtained 44% of the votes. Now the Chancellor, Hitler, already had the power of the country for a period of 4 years, starting from March 23rd. Hitler used these 4 years to reorganize Germany and strengthen his dominance, On May 10, 1933, a public burning of more than 20,000 books took place in Berlin's Bebelplatz, culminating the purge process that the Nazi Party had been conducting since its rise to power in intellectual and academic circles. Thousands of books by dangerous and anti-German authors were thrown into the fire by SA volunteers and ordinary citizens, in a manner reminiscent of a witch's Sabbath that took Europe back to darker times, though perhaps not as dark as those yet to come. On the other hand, from his podium, Goebbels, like a master conductor, proclaimed, "Germany begins to cleanse itself internally and externally." These were the necessary steps that Adolf Hitler used to eliminate his opponents. He also promulgated a law vaguely aimed at restoring the functioning of career, but which actually served to purge Jews and Marxists from state services, and in general, from any position coveted by the new Nazi leaders. Later, after his first meeting with Mussolini on June 14, 1934 in Venice, Hitler and the leadership of National Socialism, Goebbels, Göring, Heydrich and Heinrich Himmler, got rid of his once appreciated Ernst Röhm and other regime opponents. Gregor Strasser, Schleicher, Kahr, at the head of 100, all executed at point-blank range in what was called the Night of the Long Knives, on June 30, 1934. Von Papen escaped the purge thanks to the protection of Marshal von Hindenburg, still President of the Reich, but just in case he prepared to resign from his position as Vice-Chancellor and went to Vienna as ambassador. On August 2, 1934, the elderly Paul von Hindenburg, President of the Reich, died, and Hitler, thanks to a law promulgated at the same moment by him, became the supreme head of the state, unified both the ministries of state and chancellery, and the army swore allegiance to the Führer and Chancellor Adolf Hitler. At that moment, the SS had more than 100,000 men, directed by a fanatic former farmer who, according to some, surpassed the Führer himself in recklessness, referring to Himmler. Thus, Hitler accumulated the presidency of the Reich and the Chancellery with the title of Reichsführer, obtaining 88% of the votes in August 1934. From that moment, the Treaty of Versailles would almost always be present in Adolf Hitler's incendiary speeches, although during the 30s, the treaty was no longer in force, and the Weimar Republic could not be blamed for signing this treaty, as it was the monarch Wilhelm II who accepted and signed it to end the First World War. Thus, another reason for Hitler's rise to power, and what gave him acceptance in German society at that time, was that a few years after the world conflict ended in 1923, fulfilling one of the Treaty of Versailles agreements, the Ruhr Valley was invaded by the Franco-Belgians. The Germans responded with general strikes and passive resistance. To support the workers in that patriotic inactivity, the Weimar government paid them bonuses. The occupation unleashed massive financial chaos in Germany, not only impoverishing the working class, but also ruining the lower middle classes. Under armed guard, the French bourgeoisie extracted their war reparations, paralyzing the rest of the German industry. Inflation skyrocketed to an unbelievable scale. The value of the German mark dropped from 48,000 per United States dollar in May to an astronomical figure of 4.6 million in August. Unemployment dramatically increased to 23% in November. Germany, like other belligerent countries, had suffered inflation during and after the armed conflict that neither the imperial government nor the Weimar Republic wanted to tackle by raising taxes to compensate for the inflation. This caused the uncontrolled and catastrophic rise of inflation in Germany, which went from a base of 100 in January 1913 to a base of 75 trillion in October 1923. By the end of 1923, one United States dollar was worth 4 trillion marks. Day and night, 150 printing presses worked to supply the Reichsbank with paper money. Practically, the mark lost all value. However, what best explains, if anything, Hitler's takeover of power in 1933 was the desire to move away from the democratic game by those who had poorly accepted it. The aim was, in a word, to end the Constitution and the Weimar Republic, and to do so, it was absolutely essential to have Hitler by their side. Once installed in power, it took him only a few months to establish an absolute dictatorship. Immediately, he pressured Hindenburg to convene, on March 5, new elections that would allow him to achieve an absolute majority. The Reichstag fire on February 27th, attributed to the communists, allowed him to pressure Hindenburg to sign the state of emergency, which facilitated getting rid of his enemies. Thousands of communists, socialists, and pacifists were imprisoned in the first concentration camps, as well as gypsies, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, Christian clergy, and people accused of some abnormality. The first measures against Jews were legislated, and in May the Gestapo was created. Regarding the military institution, as soon as he came to power, Hitler forced all military personnel to swear loyalty to him, dismissed the Minister of War, Marshal von Blomberg, and the head of the army, General Beck, assuming all competencies himself. From 1933 onward, the ideas and actions of Nazism focused on the establishment of a dictatorial government that supported an urban popular militia, the militarization of the people and attacks on democracy, international Judaism, and communism. Already in power, Hitler began his strategy to initiate totalitarianism. By totalitarianism, we understand non-democratic political regimes characterized by the all-powerful state, which infiltrates all aspects of life, both public and private. The state is strong and is sustained by a single party that monopolizes power. The party leader is venerated as the leader of the nation, a leader to whom at times a cult is almost rendered. To remain in power, the party employs terror over the population, eliminating any type of opinion different from the official one, usually using the police and the army. The term began to be used by Western political analysts to designate the type of state forged by Stalin, but Mussolini had already used it. As we mentioned earlier in this video, this is a basic characteristic of totalitarian states. The only allowed party is the backbone of the regime, through which the dominant ideology is forcefully preached to society and the population is controlled. The party is led by a minority, a ruling elite which sets the guidelines to follow. At its pinnacle is the leader whose authority is unquestioned and to whom blind obedience is given through strict discipline. Logically, this leader is the supreme ruler, and his power, by controlling the party and the state, is practically absolute. The single party is also the springboard to achieving political power and, once in power, to maintaining it, not hesitating at any moment to use violence or coercion against those who oppose its objectives both inside and outside the party. Stalin's purges among the members of the PCUS, for example, show a blatant lack of moral and ethical scruples. An example of everything mentioned above is the German National Socialist Party, NSDAP, of Hitler, and it can also be highlighted how the state and the party become one in these types of regimes. All state media are at the service of the party, as are the means of communication, which are the tools to disseminate their messages and the only allowed voice. From there, Germany became a totalitarian regime. Individual rights and freedoms were suppressed. Companies and workers' unions were at the mercy of the state. All citizens' activities were monitored and coordinated by the police, while all opposition was oppressed, suppressed, or annihilated in concentration camps. Germany, despite being militarized, was experienced with great rejoicing by the vast majority of the population, given that the older men had participated in the First World War and the younger ones had been instilled with a deep sense of vengeance and revenge against those who had humiliated them after losing the war. It was also maintained that the Aryan or Indo-European race was the only superior race because it descended from ancient Greeks, Romans, and Germans, and that it was of total urgency to cleanse it of all non-Aryan blood, especially that of the Jews. From that moment, in the early 30s of the last century, the Nazi Party and its leader became the center of the state. Every form of opposition, even criticism, was violently repressed. Concentration camps were opened from 1933 to punish any opposition. Propaganda fostered a cult of the leader that increased incessantly and indoctrinated an increasingly fanatical people. In 1937, a strong persecution against Jews began in Germany, following the screening of an anti-Semitic film titled The Eternal Jew, which only increased the German population's hatred toward Jews. At the beginning of the following year, Nazi authorities approved a series of anti-Semitic measures, including prohibiting Jews from holding various positions, such as expulsion from public ministries, prohibition from practicing medicine already established since 1933 and accounting for 16% of all German doctors, and inability to have medical insurance. Shortly after, on the night from November 9th to 10th, 1938, a serious event occurred in Germany called Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. Part of the German civilian population rebelled against the remaining Jewish population in Germany, destroying businesses, synagogues, and other Jewish properties. For these riots to be successful, two factors were decisive. First, the explicit participation of the SA, and second, the government's passivity. The massacre figures were terrifying. 1,574 synagogues destroyed, 7,000 stores destroyed, 29 warehouses, 30,000 Jews sent to concentration camps, and 91 dead. In the invaded and annexed Austria, 94 synagogues were destroyed. Between 1934 and 1939, Nazi Germany enjoyed excellent living standards for the middle and upper classes, thanks especially to the use of forced or Jewish slave laborers and German political dissidents who worked practically for free in major German companies and the free dismissal of workers. Additionally, in 1935, the work week was increased from 60 to 72 hours. In those years, significant road communication works and ostentatious buildings were initiated. While the Nazi Party monopolized all political power, it allowed capitalism to continue being applied in Germany and did not expropriate private property, allowing German private companies to continue their activities. However, Hitler's regime promoted enormous state intervention in the economy, either by creating state service companies or by setting price controls and regulating all activities of private companies, so that German entrepreneurs had to follow government directives to preserve their properties and wealth. Otherwise, they could also be considered opponents of the Nazi regime and suffer respective repression. However, a large part of the Third Reich's economy focused on armaments and primarily on preparations for war with Slavic countries, rather than on the production of consumer goods for commercial expansion. Nevertheless, the concentration of capital in the armaments industry favored the rapid expansion of Germany's industrial potential and helped reduce unemployment. The economic policy of the National Socialist state was primarily aimed at protecting and promoting large monopolistic capital, which was reflected in most of its policies. In this regard, two types of measures can be distinguished: those aimed at obtaining markets for capital domestically, and those promoting a public works policy throughout Germany. During the 7 years of its reign, a network of 12,000 kilometers of national roads was built, which are still in use today, as well as hydroelectric dams, railway lines, and majestic buildings. The second Nazi economic trend was to boost foreign trade and the war economy. The central problem facing the German economy lay in the limitations of its domestic market. This forced German monopolistic capital to direct its outlook abroad, which culminated in the Second World War. Hitler, already in 1933 during one of his speeches, advocated for the rearmament of Germany. It took the National Socialism 2 years to drive a tremendous development of prosperity, and after 4 years, the country was already a power among the powers. Between 1934 and 1937, Hitler's Germany enjoyed excellent living standards for the middle and upper classes. One of the consequences of the antecedents mentioned at the beginning of this video is the type of ideology and culture that the Nazis imposed, which did not allow for progress or development. By obligation, the official truth had to be accepted as given, immutable, and eternal. National Socialism was the genuine product of a collection of decades during which German thought, opposed to all modernism, developed a new type of racist literature, art, and philosophy. Hitler always emphasized the ideological factor, that is, the conception of the world that a society should always have. He assigned extraordinary importance to this factor. The future Germany he preached had to be built on a new man, and this could only arise from a correct worldview, which was obviously his own. However, all this was largely made possible by propaganda, a means that served a purpose. Hitler assigned propaganda the role of a means and stated that it should be considered from the perspective of the objective it served. Consequently, its form was conditioned in such a way as to support the pursued objective. This aspect of Hitlerist propaganda theory perfectly aligns with the premise that propaganda is an instrument of power. There should be no doubt that Hitler systematized many aspects of propaganda and anticipated a large number of scholars in the field, who later reached the same conclusions as he did. Goebbels, for his part, believed that propaganda was a profound and systematic labor, which, in addition to starting from reality, required that its results be anticipated. Therefore, in a work meeting with his closest collaborators in the ministry, he stated, "An enemy should only be attacked when one is in a position to adequately respond to a great counterattack from their side." With this statement, he emphasized the need to consider the effects of the actions undertaken. Goebbels, in his diary, advocated, from the perspective of the practical realization of propaganda, for two unavoidable conditions for propaganda to adhere to the rules of starting from reality and anticipating consequences. As the situation in Germany worsened, fewer and fewer officers were allowed access to all concrete permanent data. In a period of war, the basic secret data refer to military events. Propaganda has a popular character, therefore it must adapt to the most limited intellectual capacities. Hitler stated that every act of propaganda must necessarily be popular and adapt its level to the receptive capacity of the most limited of those to whom it is intended. Hence, its purely intellectual degree should be regulated more downward, the larger the mass of human beings that must be encompassed. Like Hitler, Goebbels firmly believed in the necessity of positioning oneself at the level of the receiver so that propaganda could effectively achieve its objective. Therefore, in his diary he writes, "I have begun to seriously worry about the submarines. Their crews deserve it. I am fundamentally interested in them receiving pleasant and entertaining literature. I have ordered all my collaborators to set aside doctrinal considerations a little when it comes to deciding what they must provide to the troops and the German people for their relief and entertainment." It is through this propagandistic strategy that Hitler gained the support of the population and initiated one of the most atrocious events during the Second World War, the Jewish Holocaust. The phenomenon we call the Holocaust was a true genocide program, a biological extermination with totalizing intent, ideologically motivated, deliberately planned and very effectively executed with all the resources and machinery of a modern state and an advanced and civilized industrial society. That cold and calculated annihilating will differentiate genocide from other similar mass massacres because it is devoid of the characteristic climate of collective hysteria that leads to killing all who are perceived in a society as real or imaginary enemies under extreme circumstances of crisis, emergency, or war. Genocide, therefore, is not the simple mortal fruit of a sudden individual or collective reaction of assault and elimination of a proven or potential enemy due to a passionate outbreak of fear or hatred against them. Certainly, aside from the low military logics in war operations, the Third Reich was responsible during the Second World War for the deaths through exploitation, mistreatment, starvation, or simple elimination in concentration camps and extermination camps of millions of human beings. And that impressive massive lethal harvest took place in the unparalleled context of a 6-year total war that affected practically the entire globe, which involved all orders of social life in the affected countries as never before, mobilized masses of combatants in an unprecedented manner, and generated a legacy of over 55 million mortal victims. The Holocaust continues to stand out as the singular pinnacle of that human devastation, because only those identified as Jews by the German National Socialist authorities were chosen as targets of total, complete, and unmitigated destruction, a fate partially shared also by the Gypsies, who suffered almost 500,000 mortal victims in Nazi camps. The other groups subjected by the Nazi regime could die or live in slavery and servitude. For the Jews, only death without remission was possible. This immense genocide of European Jews was therefore exceptional, singular, and unprecedented for at least three basic and concurrent reasons. Firstly, by defining Jews as members of a degenerate, infectious, and subhuman inferior race, a race that had to be quickly and completely exterminated to prevent racial contamination and the degradation of the rest of humanity and, above all, of the superior race, the Germanic Aryans. This conception and definition of Jews as truly dangerous parasites, as a mortal and lethal virus, was preached by Adolf Hitler from his early political writings. "Judah is the plague of the world," he stated already in 1924, and it became the official doctrine of the National Socialist regime from its rise to power. And in this aspect, there was a remarkable continuity and propagandistic coherence. Thus, in 1920, one of the first National Socialist posters warned, "We combat their activities because they are the origin of the nation's tuberculosis, and we are convinced that convalescence can only begin when this bacteria is eliminated." The second reason that underpins the exceptional singularity of the Holocaust lies in the simple yet revealing fact that its planning and execution took place within Germany. Because such a phenomenon did not arise in a barbaric, uncultured, primitive and backward society, still hostage to its most primitive instincts and where civilization had not taken root nor humanized behaviors. On the contrary, the Holocaust arose and developed within one of the most advanced countries industrially, culturally, scientifically and technologically in contemporary Europe. The third and final reason for the singularity of the Holocaust resides in its modern, rational, methodical, and efficient bureaucratic organization. All the power of the German state was put at the service of an extermination program of extraordinary logistical complexity, creating a special census of Jews in Germany and all occupied Europe, devising a camouflaged language to hide the operation from the bewildered victims and the incredulous outside public, organizing specialized motorized execution brigades directed from an operational center, establishing numerous ghettos and concentration camps to which Jews from all over the continent were mass deported, and finally, planning, building and operating 6 extermination camps with their corresponding gas chambers and crematoria. It also required forming and directing a huge bureaucracy in charge of the entire operation, diplomats and administrators to compile the census, engineers and chemists to design and operate the gas chambers and crematoria, anthropologists and doctors to carry out the planned human experiments, military and police to ensure the security of the camps, economists to manage the smooth running of the productive and destructive system, railroad technicians and operators to handle the special railway network linking one center to another, and a large number of subordinate and unqualified personnel to complete the entire human framework of the genocidal system. In particular, the aforementioned extermination camps symbolize the pinnacle of that technological and bureaucratic drift because they reveal that for the Nazis, the mass murder of Jews was an end in itself, not the byproduct of a warlike and abnormal situation. Camps like Auschwitz were true death factories, an unprecedented institution until then, and still not repeated in history, planned, built, and constantly modernized with the exclusive aim of consuming human lives as they arrived at their gates. Anti-Semitic racism, turned into doctrine and official policy of the Third Reich since January 1933, only became an openly genocidal practice once the Second World War was unleashed in September 1939, and particularly after the conflict extended to Eastern Europe with the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. Before that moment, the anti-Semitic policy of the National Socialist regime had gone through the 3 previous characteristic stages of a progressively radicalized xenophobic racist process. First, the officially encouraged and fostered expansion of the latent or patent prejudice against the designated inferior and dangerous race. Second, their discrimination within society through very diverse legal and institutional measures. and third, their radical exclusion from it with a battery of segregating and confining actions. The history of that cumulative radicalization process began in January 1933, in the last crisis of the Weimar Republic, when Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. To a large extent, the exploitation of the intense popular prejudice against Jews was one of the decisive factors in the Nazis' rise to power. Immediately, Hitler made it clear that his anti-Semitism was not going to remain reduced to a mere informal and harmless prejudice, as existed prior to his rise to power. Between 1933 and 1938, multiple laws mandated the radical discrimination of Jews in German society. An official boycott of their businesses was promoted. They were expelled from public administration, education, the judiciary, and the armed and police forces. Their German nationality was revoked. Their free movement through streets and cities was prohibited, and all mixed marriages between Jews and Germans were annulled. As a result of this systematic pressure and coercion, the Third Reich would manage to expel from the country before the Second World War almost 250,000 of the 525,000 Jews residing in Germany in January 1933. With these initial measures, Hitler had implemented a measure widely demanded by the German anti-Semitic movement for many years, the rescission of the civil and political emancipation laws for Jews decreed by liberalism during the 19th century. But it would not stop there. His objective was not to restore Jews to the mere condition of pariahs, like the inhabitants of medieval ghettos, but to eliminate their presence from the economic, social, and cultural life of Germany by all possible and available means. For this reason, from the fateful night of broken glass onward, the stage of exclusion began, with the progressive deportation of the Jewish population to urban ghettos and concentration camps located in remote rural areas. All of this was endorsed by a part of German society that already enjoyed a certain status in Europe. Kristallnacht was a true pogrom. In fact, it was an assault planned by the authorities and executed by Nazi and anti-Semitic militants against all existing Jewish quarters in the cities and towns of Germany and Austria, amidst the passivity of the police and the complacency or indifference of a large part of the civilian population. The result of that pogrom was simply terrifying. In Germany, 100 Jews were brutally murdered, thousands beaten and mistreated, dozens of synagogues were set on fire and demolished. At least 8,000 Jewish-owned stores and businesses were destroyed, countless houses and private apartments were devastated, and about 30,000 Jews were arrested and sent to concentration camps in Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen. In Austria, for its part, the assault claimed the lives of 27 Jews, resulted in the destruction of 42 synagogues, and the arrest of 7,800 people who were sent to the designated concentration camps. The consequent total war and racial extermination on the Eastern Front would thus fully open the doors to mass genocide against Jews and the widespread slaughter of the captured Soviet and Slavic population in the attacked territories. And it would be a large-scale murder of Jews for a very simple and already learned reason. In occupied Poland, the Soviet Union housed the largest Jewish community in the world, and with it, emigration, deportation, or provisional and temporary resettlement would not be possible. Not in vain, apart from the 2 million Jews who lived in Belarus, Ukraine, and Crimea, there were another 250,000 Jews on the Baltic coast, 1.5 million in the newly annexed eastern Poland, and up to 350,000 Jewish refugees who had fled the Nazi advance in Central Europe. And almost the entire immense Jewish population resided in the territories that were to be the object of attack and conquest by the German Wehrmacht, and that would become bloody battlefields, with 90% of the Jews living in cities scattered throughout that area between the Baltic and Crimea. To undertake that exterminating anti-Jewish operation, Hitler authorized the formation of special mobile SS units called Einsatzgruppen, which would join the rear of the regular troops and be tasked with executing captured resistors and enemies. They would be the spearhead of an organized mass murder of Jews and would be structured into 4 sectors. Einsatzgruppen A for operations in the Baltic countries, B for Belarus, C for northern and central Ukraine, and D for southern Ukraine, Bessarabia and Crimea. Each special action group consisted of about 3,000 men, subdivided into commands and coming from the Waffen-SS, the Gestapo, and the Order Police. Their training, instruction, indoctrination and equipment were completed between March and May 1941 as part of the general war devices required by the campaign, paving the way for the fiercest extermination of Jews during total war.